Welcome to World History. Today we're going to look at reform within the Russian Empire and take our exploration of nationalism and change slightly east to return to Imperial Russia. So, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the way that Nicholas I tried to unify and modernize the Russian Empire. We are also going to evaluate the reforms of Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator. And we're going to analyze the results of the actions of a group called the People's Will and how that sort of changed the direction of the Russian Empire. So without further ado, let's return to Russia. As you hopefully remember from last semester, Russia is relatively isolated for a variety of different reasons. One is religion. Whereas most of Western Europe is either Catholic or Protestant, Russia follows what's called the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church is separate from both the Catholic Church and then the Protestant Church that broke off from it. And so they have very different customs than a lot of other Europeans. And so they lack the sort of traditional connections to Europe, something that Russia has always struggled with. Geographically, Russia is also huge and very diverse. And this is sometimes a benefit. For example, when Tsar Alexander was able to repel Napoleon's forces, Russia's large-scale isolation was beneficial. But it's somewhat problematic when Russia wants to trade with Europe because, as we remember, they only have the one warm water port, and they're constantly fighting to get more territory sort of down in the south in order to connect them in with the broader world. So Russia's isolation is both a benefit sometimes, but also potentially a curse. All of this tends to lead to Russian, what we call backwardness. So for example, we remember hopefully how Peter the Great put a beard tax on Russian nobles to try to get them to get with the times because their dress was somewhat embarrassing to a lot of more modern Russians when Europeans showed up. And so they had to sort of fight against that. And Russia still had official serfdom. Serfdom is, of course, a remnant of feudal society that had been abolished in most of Europe and then finally really gotten away with after the French Revolution. But serfs are basically slaves who are tied to the land that they live on. So as opposed to being bought or sold as we think slaves traditionally are, instead when you buy land in Russia, you would buy the land and you'd get the people who lived on that land as sort of a joint package. The plus side, of course, is you do have laborers for your land that you don't have to ever pay or really care about. The downside is because these serfs are not free to move around, Russia really didn't get any of the industrialization that we talked about happening in Western Europe, because that, of course, requires people to be able to move to cities in order to work in factories. And in Russia, that's never going to happen because the serfs are tied to the land. And so for many Russians, this serfdom represented the backwardness of the Russian Empire. But Russia was absolutely not immune from the changes coming out of the French Revolution and the different sort of types of nationalism that we've talked about so far this unit. So Tsar Nicholas I is going to attempt to bring nationalism to Russia, but he's going to do it in a very sort of Russian way by emphasizing these three principles: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Orthodoxy is going to represent or is going to focus on the supremacy of the Russian church as a way to try to unite Russians. This was valuable for Nicholas because the Russian government had control over the church, and so it increased his own power, leading to our second point, autocracy. The Tsar's absolute control, going all the way back to our absolutism unit last semester. The Tsar's power was unconditional. He was the father protector. And he, of course, embodied these two Russian principles of Grozny and Tishaishi, which we had talked about previously. The idea that he's both the powerful protector and also the father to the people. And he used these principles to focus on Russian nationality. the belief in this Russian character. We had also talked about last semester how Russia has these two sort of core identities, where sometimes they try to connect with Western Europe and sometimes they focus on their own sort of traditional values. And so this nationality tries to focus on the traditional Russianness of Russians. So focus on their traditional Russian character. He also implemented a secret police called the Third Section, which would hunt down anyone who was disloyal to the Tsar and theoretically, jail/kill them to keep him in charge. So all of these things were supposed to further strengthen and modernize the Russian state and take these new ideas of nationalism that have been so important and reform that have been so important to us and give them a really Russian character. In order to really emphasize this sort of nationalism, this Russian nationalism, we see the expansion of a policy called Russification. Russia, as we can see here, is very diverse. So Russification is an attempt to Russianify everyone within the society. So try to force people to become more Russian. That means, of course, learning the Russian language, adopting the Orthodox Church, things like that, with government-sponsored violence known as pogroms against anyone who stands out. So you become Russian or else we send people to beat you up until you become Russian, which may be successful, but obviously creates a significant amount of unrest amongst all of these non-Russian peoples that we see here. And then comes the Crimean War, which we talked about in previous lessons. The Crimean War was a massive embarrassment for Russia, just like it was an embarrassment for the Ottoman Empire. The Russian army performed very poorly. And England and France were more or less able to have their way with Russia in support of the Ottoman Empire. And then afterwards, they were able to basically force Russia to negotiate a treaty that Russia didn't super appreciate. And so the Crimean War really showed the lack of development made it clear to Russian leaders, and specifically to Nicholas, who really thought he'd built an awesome modern army that looked really good and strong on paper. It really showed him, and basically everyone else in Russia, that man, Russia had a long way to go, and they were far, far, far behind most of the other powers. So obviously, what do you do if you're far behind? Well, you jump to try to catch up. And so we get the Tsar reformer, the Tsar liberator, Alexander II. Here's our Alexander II. He had a whole series of reforms that he was going to try to carry out. We see them here. He was going to get rid of serfdom. He was going to modernize the army and get rid of corruption. He was going to give more power to local government associations and organizations known as the Zemstva. He was going to create a law system that everyone had to follow, equal laws. He was going to lessen censorship, increase education, expand the Russian economy, and give more rights to all of these nationalities. And so he launched this massive proposal, this huge platform. The problem is, again, follow up and follow through. You can propose all these things, but in the end, you have to have people willing to carry this stuff out. And so Alexander was not totally up to the task of completely remaking Russia, although he did have some pretty large effects on Russian history. The most important effect is he did free the serfs. So the liberator was able to pass a law to free serfs. And so the 90% of Russian society that was peasants who were literally bound to the land they were born on, now with Alexander, they're free. Unfortunately, with that freedom also came debt, because the serfs had to pay their former owners for their freedom in order to make it so the nobles weren't mad at Alexander. And so what ended up happening is a system of sharecropping in which this debt tied the new serfs to their landowners, and they would basically be trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty that did not really improve their lives at all. And so because of the way in which he freed the serfs are technically free, but they will forever be in debt to their landlord. And unless they just simply run away from their lands, they're never going to actually be able to improve their lives. So, actual benefit of the whole liberation, questionable. And so, a lot of Alexander's other reforms, much like his freeing of the serfs, didn't really amount to any actual change in Russia. For example, there was a new system of laws, and the government had to actually provide evidence in order to convict you. And so there were actual criminal courts, and it wasn't just summary execution. But the government could get around this by deporting anyone they wanted to Siberia. And so, yes, there were courts, but the government could circumvent them. And so this led to significant anger amongst liberals who wanted to reform Russian society. So these liberals formed a series of secret societies, the most famous of which is known as the People's Will, who decided that change could only happen if Russian society was completely remade. And so they set out to kill the Tsar. There's all of these awesome plots. My favorite one is a guy came up to Alexander and tried to shoot him in the garden, and somehow Alexander dodged 5 bullets as he was running away. But eventually his carriage was bombed twice, and Alexander was blown to bits by assassins after, about a dozen different assassination attempts. So the Tsar Liberator, despite his best efforts, doesn't change Russia profoundly and then gets blown up, as we see here. And so his son, Alexander III, takes over, and he's going to really push back against all these reforms and basically roll the clock back because, he just watched his dad get blown to bits by a bomb after trying to make things better. So Alexander III here is well, what's the point? So he's going to crack down on dissidents. He's going to make an even stronger secret police. The famous Akhrana, who basically has absolute power to jail/kill whoever they want. And we're going to see reactionary conservatives retake over Russia, and the age of reform is going to grind to a halt, and nothing is really going to change. So with Alexander III, we get traditional autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality that we saw from Nicholas I, re-entrenched, and very little progress in Russia. Which brings us back to our objectives for the day. So hopefully you can respond to these things, and when we come back, so that brings us back to our objectives for the day. Hopefully you can respond to these things and explain the extent to which Russia was able to embrace this era of nationalism and change that we've been talking about in all these different places.